All right, we are recording. This is the April 2nd, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agricultural and Ecosystem Subcommittee.
There's David.
It's David. And our first bit of business is to approve the minutes and agenda, the agenda for this meeting and the minutes for our last meeting. Okay, Jane just wrote, so she'll be here in a minute. Anyone have any comments or questions on either our agenda, proposed agenda for this week, or the minutes from last Friday's meeting? Everyone good? Okay. So hearing no comments or opposition, can we approve both those things? Good. All right. Thank you. Thumbs up. Next is the update from the steering committee. I think Jane's going to meet us, join us shortly to give that update. And we're going to talk through the RFP. For folks, members of the public who are joining us, thanks for your interest and for spending some time with us this morning. We will have a block of time at the end of the meeting for public comment, and when we get nearer to that, we'll ask for a show of hands of folks who are interested in speaking so we can allocate that time appropriately. And I don't know, anyone have a story they want to tell while we're waiting for Jane?
I have a question, Billy.
Sure.
The stuff that Jane sends us to read over, does she want comments, or is she sending it to us as an FYI?
I believe, and this is the RFP materials.
It's everything she sends us.
Okay. I think that's a good question for her, because I don't always know exactly what she's sending whom. I think she's probably only looking for comments if she asks for them specifically, but I think that's a great question to ask her when she joins us, because I know there's a lot of stuff that comes flying at us from me, from Abby, from Jane. So getting some clarity from her on what her expectations are, I think makes a lot of sense. I know that certainly the proposed RFP, I think she is interested in our comments on, but beyond that, let's ask her.
Okay, thanks.
Jake, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. So I'm still receiving emails like from Jane and I think you, Billy and Abby, into my work email, which is I'm not worried about that, but I do have my partner email set up now, and I wasn't sure if like there was gonna be a full transition point, and also just a note on that, I was having trouble with my password. I called the help desk, and they said that there was like a kind of a reset, so I lost like a week's worth of whatever communications did come into my partner email, and that may have happened to others, and just wanted to note that. So I may have missed some things in that account, but now I'm all set, and it sounds like everything's good. So just wanted to make a note of that too.
Well, I had my own little struggles. I after several calls to the IT people, they finally gave up and said they would have someone call me back, and no one ever did. But they have been unable to set my password, so it's my own fault. I stopped calling them on Wednesday out of a peak of just being irritated about it. But I'll pick it up this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be all set. But I'm glad anyway that I'm still getting emails at my work email.
And on that note too, David, I got directed to a different help desk because the domain is under ANR. So I had to navigate kind of some difficulties with the reset, and then I spoke to a person at ANR's help desk, and they were able to address the issue for me.
The same thing happened to me. Do you want the telephone number for the help desk at A&R.
Yeah, can you put it in the chat? I just got a text from the help desk at ADS this morning that said I need to reach out to the A&R help desk, and they didn't give me the phone number. So Judy, that'd be helpful, and that sounds like probably what David needs to do too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, guys.
It's not your fault.
Yeah, it's not, yeah.
I
No
know,
worries. No worries.
but there's no worry. Like, if there's something that you find yourself being like, what are they talking about? I have searched my whole email. Just like let us know, and we'll, you know. I do understand. It took me quite a while to get mine all set up in the different places it needed to be, and to be able to access it from all of those places. So I'm empathetic to the struggles that hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's been so difficult. And I think, Jake, to answer your question, my hope is that as soon as possible, we shift to just sending stuff to folks through the partner email. But I just wasn't sure if everyone was set up yet, and it doesn't sound like everybody is. So maybe, we can check in again early next week, and once everyone is good to go, then we could use that, use the partner email address only unless people have a preference otherwise.
And just, I mentioned last time that when I went to activate my partner email, it did not activate my partner email. It reactivated my former state email. And I haven't gone back and changed that because I didn't get the impression from Jane that that was a problem, that you could use my, that was still valid, state email. So apart from getting invited to meetings that I no longer have any interest in at all, and so far, Ryan, I haven't had any complaints from people about farms. So if I do get any of those, I'll be forwarding them. But I just want to make sure that if I just keep john.roberts@vermont.gov, that's okay, and I don't have to go fight with the same people you've all been fighting with.
I see Jane is here and she has her hand raised, and being the overall leader of this effort, hopefully she can answer some of our questions here.
Well, thanks for, I just wanted to echo that this has been a consistent theme, and about the partner emails. So I've been getting lots of emails about the email, and as a result have not made it a priority this week because it's also my job to go back through and take you all the email distribution lists, clean them up with your work emails, and I'll reshare them with Abby and Billy and all of you. So there'll be a consistent email distribution list for this subcommittee going forward that will draw on your partner accounts. But since I've heard this theme from many folks, I've just been letting it play out and haven't made it a priority to update that yet. So I guess I'll just leave it as I'll let it play out for a bit longer and probably send an email to all subcommittee members sometime next week, confirming, giving like a window of 2 days or something to let me know if there's a problem still. And barring not hearing anything, then I'll make the shift with the email addresses. But for now, we can just continue with work email addresses. And my apologies, is not my area of expertise either. And maybe one of my updates, which will make everybody as happy as it makes me, is that we finally got approval and posting for a program coordinator who will sort of shift the administrative work out of the Agency of Administration from Melissa, and then consolidate the work in A&R. And I mentioned that mostly because it'll be live on the state website as of today, and encourage you to share it with anybody who's interested in helping advance this effort, that I can actually, and I will share the job description with all subcommittee members and counselors to try to get the word out as far as we can to get some help.
Great. Thanks, Jane. So we're at the part of our agenda, Jane, where we're looking, the first two items are an update from the steering committee and then the review of the draft technical assistance RFP. And I think you're kind of on point for both those. So why don't you feel free to use this time as you see fit.
Thanks, Billy. Sorry to be a few minutes late. First off, the steering committee meeting, and I encourage Lauren as a counselor who sits on the steering committee to chime in if I miss anything. But wanted to let everybody know that the theme of that meeting was really to consolidate and agree to the subcommittee charges that, and specifically which subcommittee would be sort of task lead and on point. And there was no, I think everybody at the steering committee level was happy to hear that perhaps that what was felt like perceived conflict at the council meeting around who was on first for what topic. Once we had those conversations last week amongst co-chairs and then within the subcommittees, it felt very consistent that how all the co-chairs were thinking about their roles and responsibilities as it pertained to resiliency work, resiliency in the built environment versus resiliency in natural and working lands and ecosystems, sitting firmly in this committee, and built environment in rural resilience, and as well as consistent with that cross-sector mitigation was responsible ultimately for pulling together the comprehensive plan with respect to emissions reductions, but sees a clear and appropriate role for this committee in feeding in the bulk of the recommendations with respect to reductions in ag emissions. So I think we're all recognizing that we want it to be as neat and tidy as possible, but this work is really overlapping, and that as long as we have a clear vision on who's tackling what, that coordination will happen both with thoughtful coordination between the subcommittees as well as sort of naturally, I think, as we plan up. So we're good to go with the charges. They've been approved. Everybody supports the way they've been drafted. Maybe I'll just pause there and before I move to the other main topic of the steering committee and see if Lauren or anybody has any questions. Okay.
I guess just a quick question. So based on that outcome, it sounds like our current charge is good and consistent, and we don't have to just be mindful of those kind of caveats. We don't really have to change anything right now.
Nope. Great. You're good to go. And then finally, I think what many of the subcommittees are interested in having in front of them as they especially think about work planning is the idea of a draft outline of what the climate action plan will look like. And we have put pen to paper as the first sort of draft of an outline. And we had a really good conversation at the steering committee. And this morning I had further conversation with the facilitator, just thinking about and digesting what we heard at the steering committee meeting. And I expect that the bulk of the next climate council meeting will be with more input along the way, with one more steering committee meeting in between that and the next council meeting, will be sort of rallying around a final outline. And that really gets us thinking about sort of how we think about, first and foremost, the specificity with respect to the 3 different year targets for the statutory requirements around emission reductions. So how much are we building in with respect to detailed recommendations and strategies for 2025? What does it then look like for 2030? And what does it look like for 2050 in this first plan? Making sure we're all in agreement on how we're tackling that with greenhouse gas reductions. And then I also think there's going to be a big role with this committee in thinking about how sequestration fits into the plan. I'll just suggest that there are varying approaches across states that have climate action plans to how they've dealt with sequestration. In California, for instance, there's 3 separate plans, one for emission reductions, one for sequestration and conservation, and one for resiliency, versus Maine, who kept it all very much intertwined. And I think that I would suspect Lauren, if she wanted to speak up, but I see a role, and I think it would encourage thinking about how we embed sequestration goals and planning within the greenhouse gas emissions targets, and recognizing that they can't really be separated out, nor should they, with respect to the role of sequestration. And that'll sort of feed into how we talk about the RFP and technical services as well. So that's sort of like, I feel like the outline that we discussed with the steering committee yesterday really was almost like an outline for a plan for greenhouse gas reductions. And now I need to go back and really think about how and where sequestration and resiliency work fits in. And that will be the next conversation with the steering committee. And then I look forward to sort of presenting that to the full council in a few weeks, with the recognition that that will really then feed templates for all of you around what do strategies and recommendations look like, and hopefully we'll be within the next few weeks handing you all some substantive tools to be working on advancing. So that's my hope with that, as well as using the next council meeting to think about the role of the council for the next few months. As you know, the substantive work will really be happening at the subcommittee level right now, and sort of thinking about how we shift the council to viewing itself as a plenary kind of advisory board to the subcommittees for a few months. And perhaps that would mean more frequent, shorter meetings. So that's sort of what I'm teeing up with the steering committee for the next council meeting. So I'll pause there, let anybody add anything or ask any questions, and then look forward to shifting to talking about where we are with the RFP and the role of this committee in helping advance that. Fridays are easy. Everybody's done for the week. Not too many questions.
I have like a really big question that I was
good.
hesitating to ask, but now that you said that, so
I have a cup of coffee. So
is there any clarity in the act about whether the emissions reduction requirements are kind of gross or net, right? Like that comes to the question of the role of sequestration, and are these like hard net or gross reductions of emissions, or do we let increased sequestration factor into those gross to net totals? And probably don't have to answer it today, but I think that's something we're going to need to understand as we move forward.
Well, yes, I think I can tell you that we are viewing the statutory requirements as gross emissions, but that role of how we then think about sequestration and just highlights the importance of the carbon budget, and thinking about how we showcase sequestration efforts and think about perhaps the realities of how we actually are going to hit the really aggressive statutory requirements for like 2050. And maybe the fact that, because in 2050, that's the first spot where we start to talk about net zero in the law. And so, but if for the understanding of everybody in this committee, in case we haven't really highlighted this at this committee yet, if the likelihood, the way we sequester carbon right now in our lands and land management will be net zero around the time we hit our 2030 target, but yet we don't speak to it in the law to getting net zero to 2050. So like, where's the incentive to do more and be better with sequestration is the question, I think, that folks raised with the way the law was drafted. But that's a conversation for this group and how we showcase and talk about the role of forests and agriculture and soil and sequestration more broadly. But yes, we're thinking about it from a gross emission standpoint, and the way the greenhouse gas inventory is teed up for we started to talk about it in cross-sector mitigation yesterday. There are going to be some internal A&R conversations about how we track the inventory currently, whether it's in compliance with the IPCC, the EPA requirements, all of that, how we could do better, whether DEC wants to take that on internally, or right now we have review of the greenhouse gas inventory in the technical analysis, but some of that work could come out and sit with DEC, with Department of Environmental Conservation, who currently manages the greenhouse gas inventory. But I suspect they will want assistance through a contractor to help advance it in a timely manner. So the reason I brought that up is largely the greenhouse gas, and Allie should check me at any point because I think Allie understands this better than me. But the greenhouse gas inventory largely is gross emissions right now, but there are some components within the greenhouse gas inventory that get at sequestration, but only minor components. of those, what could be thought about. And that's why we are thinking about a carbon budget that would account for sequestration. Allie, go for it.
Trying to lower my hand. Hold on. Yeah, I think this really gets complex here when we think about what are emissions and what is sequestration. Right now, my understanding of the greenhouse gas inventory is that they do include forest sequestration and biomass emissions, but they're not included in the greenhouse gas inventory itself. It's an appendix. But, thinking about things like land use change, that is a source of greenhouse gas emissions. How do we account for that? So there's just kind of these big questions of what are we talking about, I guess, when we talk about greenhouse gas inventory? How do all these things factor in? So that's kind of a big picture question. But what I was going to say, too, about sequestration and its role is there are a lot of examples where that mitigation effect of trees, we don't actually just have to think about forests. We can think about trees in our urban areas and along streets and in people's yards, that they provide a really important resilience effect. So, we can think about increasing trees along riparian areas that have so many benefits. It also sequesters carbon. So I think that's important to not discount the dual impacts that we could think about there. But yeah, happy to talk more about the carbon budget in particular.
Yeah. Ryan, did you have another comment on it?
Yeah, just wanted to say I appreciate this topic being raised. This is a very large area of discussion that, from the perspective of the Agency of Ag, we would like to be had when we talk about gross emissions from agriculture, what's not included from sequestration and other soil storage that may exist on farms. Specifically to the emissions inventory, the technical services RFP is the next agenda item, so maybe I can provide a comment that can segue into that. But yeah, gaps in the current emissions inventory for how it can be possible to quantify changes in management for agricultural lands that can affect emissions is, I think, a large part of what may be a gap within the technical services RFP. I imagine each sector has their own specific nuanced details that they may like to see included. And so a conversation about how best to get those comments to the drafters of the RFP, as well as the coordination we've had with DEC and Colin on this point. But trying to raise those specific questions is a question I have for the next agenda topic. Thanks.
Well, why don't, barring any opposition, why don't we move on to that?
Okay, so why don't I just give you a brief overview on where we are with the technical analysis RFP. I think pretty much, I expect that most of you know this background, but just for the sake to ensure that we all have a common understanding, there's a budget for the Global Warming Solutions Act that included and prioritized contractual services for facilitation, for communication engagement, and then for the technical analyses needed to draft the climate action plan. That by far is the largest part of the budget. And this first RFP, I think, gets at many of the sort of scientific analyses that we need for this first climate action plan, but it is no way comprehensive yet. There may have been smaller components of technical analyses that are not included here, and there will be space over the next few weeks once this one is out the door to consider to further consider any work that might be needed through a grant or contract. Some of the things that have been already highlighted is some climate assessment work, perhaps that could be granted, a small component to UVM, perhaps some mapping that might be needed for just transitions, and then some work for the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Committee around municipal vulnerability indices. So those are some of the things that you won't see in this RFP, and mostly what this RFP gets at is the questions around greenhouse gas inventory, well, reductions, I should say, the statutory reductions, but it also includes what your subcommittee is most interested in, which is the carbon budget and the greenhouse gas inventory, and that is largely because it all informs ultimately the modeling and the work, as well as thinks about hard to separate out those components, nor would we want to likely. So Billy, before I was in this position, actually spearheaded on behalf of the agency, putting out an RFI back at the beginning of February that asked 8 sort of questions. That those 8 questions were informed then by the 15 proposals that we got from consultants. And with the help, the really thoughtful help of Jared Duval, TJ Poor, Public Service Department, we were able to digest those 15 proposals and consider on top of what we now know that the Public Service Department is advancing in service of the Comprehensive Energy Plan and our support to use the modeling that's also happening for a Comprehensive Energy Plan. What do we need to do in this first RFP or learn from put out in this RFP? And so with that information that I believe I shared with this subcommittee, also the memo that Jared took the lead on writing with input from TJ and I last week, I took all the responses I got mostly from Public Service Department staff, as well as DEC input and science and data input, subcommittee input, and drafted the RFP. And so the RFP now that is in front of you has been vetted by the Science and Data Committee, and also vetted yesterday by cross-sector mitigation. And I'll just suggest that I've only incorporated the comments from the Science and Data Subcommittee, and I still have some comments and work to do based on what I heard at cross-sector mitigation committee yesterday. This is all moving. Well, it's not moving perhaps as fast as it should because we really need these services to start up, but we're moving. It still feels like quite fast, but our hope and expectation is that after today's meeting with all of you and some further small work around some of the scope of services, that we'll have a final RFP to post by the end of next week. The steering committee has signed off they have signed off on a process of me working with the subcommittee, specifically science and data's approval, but also with input from you all and cross-sector mitigation to finalize that RFP and get it out, recognizing that I'm now learning that perhaps even what felt like a conservative timeline of having these services on by May 1st, seeing how hard the engagement and outreach contract is to finalize because of the threshold. This is likely going to be a whole other state contracting threshold. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have these services in place for 6 weeks from now at a minimum. So really it feels kind of fast, but I know once it goes out, there's going to be a lot of back and forth and thought also. So specifically, I'll just wanted to highlight, and I can share with all of you, your role, and I might try to really harness the subcommittee's review and input really around the first 2 components of the scope of services, which is because I've got enough like eyes and ears on the other components, and those are really sitting squarely within science and data and cross-sector mitigation. So rather than bringing so many cooks in the kitchen, I would appreciate the focus of this group thinking about the greenhouse gas inventory. Although I will just say that DEC is sort of on board with the way we have it there, and we're meeting internally. And so unless there's like Ryan, now is the time that we really want to dive into that a little bit with concerns around ag. That's great. I also think that we're moving towards ensuring that will work with the way DEC does the greenhouse gas inventory, as well as the way the Comprehensive Energy Plan is thinking about it. And so I think that will be as good as it should be ultimately. And really, the carbon budget had been embedded within that first scope of services as like A, B, C, D, and do a carbon budget. And in drawing out the importance of the carbon budget, felt like that should be a standalone item. And I really hoped that the work of this committee, besides asking any broader questions you have around the RFP, would be to consider and refine what some more detail would look like with respect to how we develop a carbon budget and what we're asking for. And I reached out to Allie ahead of this meeting just to tee her up to help facilitate and talk about that if that is where the subcommittee would like to go, knowing that Allie has put a lot of thought into this area already, and knowing that many of you have more experience with this than I do. So I'll just say that all of that is to say, I'm not opposed to also hearing other comments, and or if you have nitpicky grammar comments that you can't let go of, you're welcome to send those to me also in edits. And I will incorporate what I can over the next few days and then turn around a final RFP for you guys to sort of sign off on next week at your subcommittee meeting, especially with respect to the carbon budget. So I'm happy to put it up on the screen, or I'm happy just to help facilitate a conversation around that specific item or any other questions you have. Go for it, Ryan.
Sure, thanks. This is a question with regards to the level of detail you're looking for and comments and the appropriate way to incorporate into this RFP. For the RFP, the contractor needs to understand what they're bidding on and what technical services they may need to bring to bear. And so some of the specific questions around the ag emissions inventory and some of the methods that are used in the SIT tool and other opportunities that may exist for more refined management options within that tool. Is that something to be included during contract negotiation under the scope of work? If we share those details with you, because it, as written, the contractor would need to look at agricultural emissions when it says, look at all the sources. But some of the specific questions and gaps we've identified, we'd like to make sure those are understood. And so trying to understand what the best place in the process is to share those specific questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess I see a couple options. One, we have a meeting next week with DEC staff specifically around the greenhouse gas inventory and understanding what should be in the RFP and what could be done in-house. And I wonder if we haven't cast that initial meeting wide enough, and perhaps we should have representatives from the ag agency there to think about those components with us, understanding the expertise you bring. So that's one idea, how to get at what is the level of specificity that should be there in the RFP. And then two, I should have highlighted that I see a really critical role ultimately with the subcommittees, specifically science and data and cross-sector, but also I would expect someone from this subcommittee in being part of the review team to select a contractor. And so one of the things that I'll say hasn't been refined perfectly yet, and Megan O'Toole, who is an attorney within DEC, is helping me with, is ensuring, she's going through with the fine eye for the legal language, but also thinking about, do I have it right with respect to the appropriate level of detail that we're asking for with respect to approach for work? I'll just say that, which you may have all seen in the memo that was sent around, there's sort of there's three likely outcomes from proposals. One, a super consultant who can do everything in the technical analysis that we're asking for. Two, the more likely scenario where that you have one super kind of consultant who's managing a team of consultants, and that's all being put forward on who's going to do what for which component of the technical analysis. Or three, you could parse the work up into multiple contracts, which I'll just say is not the preference of me and the state, mostly because then you'd be the sort of general contractor overseeing multiple contracts for smaller components. So what we want to do is ensure that when the proposal is weighted towards one contract, and that contract also allows for the opportunity for smaller consultants to get pulled in under a team, but that also means that we'll be really looking for a lot of detail on their approach to the work. And I think specifically around the greenhouse gas inventory and the carbon budget, it would be great to have expertise reviewing those proposals to ensure they understand the details that you're speaking to, Ryan.
Thank you. As an administrator of many grants and contracts, absolutely support having as few as possible for efficiency. And then I appreciate all that background. I won't monopolize the conversation anymore, but just to share our top two gaps. The first one was touched on in the first comment by Billy, which is the review of the inventory methodology. the separate tracking of emissions and sequestration, and what is the best practice for calculating net emissions? Is it appropriate? We understand the law is written as it is. Should the law be changed, or how should that be addressed? I think is an important consideration. And then the second, as I just shared, are opportunities to include more specificity within the SIT tool for agriculture, for including different agricultural management throughout the different areas of emission, as those are something that could inform a more accurate emissions calculation, but also is going to be important for tracking and modeling and accounting for emissions reductions as farmers adopt different practices if we're looking at cropland management specifically outside of some technological adaptation. So those are our top two comments. I'm happy to add them in the document as well, but wanted to just make sure I shared that as part of this meeting.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Alyssa? Wait, you went back to being muted. You went unmute and then back.
Thank you. Just looking over the RFP that you shared, I have more just general, like, quick response. I was surprised to not see any kind of specific analysis of how cost effective different sectors might be, or different opportunities might be for influencing overall net emissions reductions. And I think it just, more specifically, I think it's really important that we're timely about understanding whether or not sequestration in agricultural landscapes will be part of the strategy that the state heads towards, because we see and have heard from different carbon markets trying to reach out to farmers that would like to purchase those ecosystem services. And I don't think you can double count them in the state's inventory. And so just making sure that we are proactive about deciding whether or not the state wants to pursue that, and have that be a really science-informed perspective on what the potential is and how it compares to other strategies that the state might invest in for meeting kind of the overall picture.
So I just want to say, when you
to include
that feels like a really important thing. And I will say that besides like general conversations that Allie and I have, or Secretary Moore and I have about, carbon credit programs, and, the fact that we're not at a tipping point yet where we've sold so many carbon credits that we're not going to be able to count, like, sequestration in Vermont towards our goals. But it could happen, right? If the state started selling off carbon credits all over the place and then couldn't count that for our own purposes of sequestration and goals. And but I just will say that that's a really important consideration, and I have not thought about it in the couching. Like, there's clearly components of the RFP that speak to cost effectiveness of pathways for gross emission reductions, but there is nothing in that RFP that thinks about cost effectiveness for net emission reductions. And we surely talk about it all the time at the agency when we do wetland restoration. That is a really cost-effective strategy that has so many benefits beyond just cleaning up Lake Champlain, and so we think about that all the time. And I think that I would think we would surely want to think about that when we're thinking about the implementation of our climate action plan. So I'll give that some more thought. And if you have ideas, please speak out to them.
Ryan has heard me say this, but I also just want to flag that you're going to run into the fact that cooperatives with dairy are starting to do this counting and LCA measurements as well. And so you're going to have to begin to contend with that and figure out where and who gets to count what and how. Organic Valley is well underway with that process, and I'm guessing that it's just a matter of time before others come along. So that's already something that I see as going to be a necessary part of the discussion. Judy, you had a few comments in the chat. Did you want to speak?
Wait, sorry, Abby. I interrupted Alyssa because I was really excited about her comment. So I just want to make sure she was done.
So sorry.
No, I think Abby's comment was really perfect. I know that there are many different conversations around this happening in different ways. And I think that it's not a simple question to answer. And so having some piece of these RFPs that you're thinking about address that really comprehensively and touch base with all the conversations that are happening would be important. There's people outside of Vermont that are, trying to figure out how to get as many farmers enrolled in their contracts as possible. There are other programs that are kind of vertically integrated corporation and cooperative counting programs, and the PES working group is having this conversation as well. And it would be really helpful to just know what direction this effort is headed sooner than later, and having some thought put into it. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Judy, you do you want to speak to any of these comments, or want me to try to address them to the best of my ability?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the Bureau of Land Management have tribal liaisons that work with reservations and indigenous land owners to assist in developing climate action plans for their land, and they're very good. They have some really great ideas, and I felt that there was TEK was missing from this this plan, and I just thought that it should be in some places. It too is a science and should be treated as a science, and so I would like to see a merging of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science.
Great. Thank you. So mindful that I don't want to cut off conversation short, one idea that came, like cross-sector mitigation had a specific number 4 within the scope of services, needs some further work, and that speaks directly to the role of that subcommittee. So 2 subcommittee members were sort of tasked with helping me finalize that. And so one idea here would be that Allie and then anybody else who was interested could just help me sort of tease out how much detail we want to put in for the carbon budget or any revisions to the greenhouse gas inventory number 1 in the scope of services. And I could work closely with them over the next few days just to make sure I have that right, and then share with you all the final RFP. As well as think about Alyssa's comment about cost effectiveness for net zero strategies, sequestration strategies.
That sounds like a good approach. I don't know. We don't really have the time today to get into this in great detail, and folks probably need a little bit more time to digest it. So I think that's a workable approach from my perspective.
Thank you. Charlie?
Thanks. I just had I'd love to get into the carbon budget in more detail and hear Allie's thoughts around that. I just had a process question on number 3, just to make sure I'm reading it right. To conduct analyses of identified emissions reduction pathways. So is that interpreted as the consultant is going to conduct an analysis of the potential opportunities that like this committee puts forward, or are they going to be looking at separate ones to analyze? Just thinking about how that process is going to work, and then the timeline for it, so that if it's coming from us, we have it to them in time for them to process it and do their work. Or am I misinterpreting that completely, and that's something completely different than what we're going to be putting forward?
Yeah, nope, that is, so something else I don't think I've shared with this group, but have started to share with others, is a timeline for the work associated with this technical analysis, and trying to show what can happen in parallel to the work that's happening out of the comprehensive energy plan modeling. So some things like respect to number 4 and thinking about how we sort of pull the policy levers and thinking about the ideas that we put forward and the economics associated with that can't really start happening until the LEAP model is built, which won't be till August. And so what that means, but yes, there are some analysis that can start happening sooner, like the business as usual, which is spoken to up above in number 3. And you're right that most of what they'll be analyzing are ideas and scenarios that are developed through the subcommittee work. And then there's one part down here, number 5, that we spoke about yesterday with cross-sector, where we wanted to, like, develop is actually not the right word that we want to have here, that I have to play around with, because this gets at sort of putting forward more that the consultant will be developing a suite of policies to review and analyze for us, but that's not, it's really an iterative process where we're going to be giving them some, they're going to also be helping us think through them with respect to their knowledge and expertise from other state planning processes. But yeah, it's really going to be a back and forth. And when we're ready to dive into this, perhaps at another meeting with all of you, I do have a timeline and thinking about what can start happening now with respect to, like, methodologies for the carbon budget and how we're going to want to cooperate between this committee and the Science and Data Committee to inform that, even without having the consultant on board yet. And then what will have to come later and when we'll know what with respect to the modeling and analysis.
Great. Well, does anyone else have any questions or comments on the draft RFP they want to get into right now? And if not, maybe we can identify some members to work with Jane over the coming days to wrap this up. Yes, John.
Can I just make a very minor comment? You know, right at the beginning, it talks about under the Global Warming Solutions Act, not less than 26%, and all these percentages. Isn't it? Surely it's possible to put actual numbers in there. It has to reduce by X amount of carbon. Personally, I would find that easier to digest than 26% of whatever. It's just a personal comment.
Yeah, that it's
an
straight
actual number might be useful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we can do that.
Okay. Do we have, so Jane, just to be clear, what you're looking for is members with an interest and expertise in specifically issues related to kind of carbon accounting from the natural, agricultural and forestry landscape to help input, and anyone else who has a particular interest in this topic. So members who are interested, anyone want to just raise their digital hands so we can see who's out there? Okay. So we've got Charlie, Alyssa, Ryan, and John, and Lauren.
But I don't know that I necessarily need to be part of that conversation so much as I just have a couple of comments that I was planning on sending directly to Jane based on how I heard the process folding yesterday. Jane, is that inaccurate, or should I just join this group so you kind of get a compiled agriculture and ecosystems comments and questions? Do you have a preference?
Are your comments broadly for the RFP or specific for 1 and 2?
1 and 2.
Okay. Sure. You can just send those to me. Yes. Okay. And then one I might suggest, if this works for folks, just knowing the tight timeline, that Allie and I put together a draft, a more refined draft for 1 and 2, and then share it with this group to sort of test it and then inform. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think since we have only had this document for a day or so, I would like to invite everyone, if this is okay with you, Jane, to continue to review it, and feel free to share kind of written comments with you, maybe, by what, end of the day today, sometime on Monday.
End of the day, Monday would be fine.
Okay, super. So do you have what you need from us on this topic?
I do. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. Alyssa, do you have your hand up for a question or, okay. And then I know, Jane, while you're with us still, Judy and others had some questions about your expectations for our kind of responsiveness when you send materials out. Are you looking for us to kind of comment on everything that you send us? Are some of the materials you send us just kind of FYI type pieces? And if you could help clarify that.
Sure. I guess, well, first and foremost, there are things that come to you as broad subcommittee members and engaged in the Climate Council, and many of those will be FYIs, I suspect. But the ones that I send related to this committee are in advance of conversations that will happen here. So I wouldn't really worry about asking or providing feedback ahead of your subcommittee meeting. And if there are actual things that I need to get back from all of you, I will include a clear expectation around a date and a turnaround so that you know to get something back to me. Does that answer it? I'm sure there's a lot of things coming at you. Good.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's helpful. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Jane. Look forward to see where the final RFP lands, because this is an important piece for us to move forward. Okay, so let's get back to our agenda. We're a little bit behind schedule, but I think we can make that time up a little later in the morning. Next item here is to finalize our kind of task coordination and member focus areas. I can share my screen right now. Abby and I had looked at kind of what you all had self-identified as your areas of interest, and tried to slot people in under the various task groups in a way that seemed to respect people's preferences and put good diversity of members and expertise, where it made the most sense. I think we can talk about whether this should change and whether, and I guess my point would be, this is not like a hard and fast distribution of labor. I think all of us are still part of the subcommittee. All of us are going to be working on all these topics. This is more just a way to help organize some of the more detailed work that might have to occur under each one of them. So even if you're not identified as part of a task coordination group, it doesn't mean you're not going to have full awareness and input into the work that those groups are doing as part of our broader subcommittee charge. So I guess I'll just put this up here for now and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts or suggestions to change it. And if you have questions about why certain people are in certain places, I'm happy to try to explain that to the best of my ability. So, anything on that? Great. All right. So let's proceed like this, and we can always make adjustments as time goes on. And this gets us into our next agenda item, which is really about, how do we move forward, and how do the task groups kind of get the actual work done. So let me get rid of this. Okay, so I had sent out to you all the kind of final detail of that task 5 that kind of explains each one of these focus areas. If anyone has any comments or want to tweak that document further, let me know. I can pull it up and we can do it. But I think, my sense is that it pretty well reflected where we're at for now, understanding those things may change over time. And I think the conversation Abby and I want to have with you all now is like, how do we take those things and then turn them into work plans, implementable work, prioritized actions that are going to lead to recommendations to ultimately inform the plan. Charlie.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and it's not, the content of the document looks great, and I apologize if I didn't pick up on this before, but could you just elaborate on the overarching task itself? States with completed equity impact assessment. And just, is that something the committee's doing, the consultant's doing? Are we doing it together, or how is that being defined, I guess, also? Thanks.
It's a great question. And I don't know, Jane, if you have, I have my sense of it, but you can probably give a more definitive answer.
Well, the equity assessment tool is something that Just Transitions is working on, although there's been a lot of discussion on how and when that would be applied. First and foremost, I'll just say that they focused on trying to deliver to all the subcommittees guiding principles in the next few weeks. That would sort of be the lens with respect to equity and inclusion that they would like to see, so that you all have that in your hands as you're starting to think about things right out of the gate. But the idea of other climate action plans there's been equity assessment tools that all of the policy ideas, recommendations have all been sort of run through after development, and then sort of revised based on that. So that is a statutory task of the Just Transitions Committee.
So it sounds like
I see Judy's comment about equity to who. It's supposed to be equity to all Vermonters.
But it sounds like the Just Transitions Committee will be developing essentially a rubric of how we look at that, and then either we'll be applying our work to that rubric, or they will apply it to our work.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Judy.
So Jane, we're not talking about equity to the land.
I'm sure that will, I mean, that'll certainly be a component of the guiding principles, and I don't have a ton of familiarity with equity assessments to date, but they're starting to talk about that. And it is really focused on, Just Transitions movement comes out of like a labor force movement, and that's what the name of the committee is, and thinking about the equity to jobs and people as you decarbonize in the future. But that is not the only focus that the Just Transitions Committee has thought about. They're certainly thinking about the underpinning to land as well. And I just don't know what that form will be, how that will take shape quite yet. But it's certainly part of the conversation there.
Good, because to keep people and economy in the center and the main focus is not going to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. Soil and land have to be in the center. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you.
So we'll get more guidance on that piece going forward, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some feedback to Just Transitions if we think it's not comprehensive enough. But yeah, I think, Charlie, the basic premise is that we'll have to run our recommendations through some filter based on equity, TBD. Lauren.
Yeah, question for Jane as she sneezes. Jane, isn't there a conversation going on in Just Transitions to potentially have liaisons, or at least like semi-regular members in each of the different subcommittees, so they can both share with us what they're talking about and bring back our concerns, like Judy just elevated, back to their considerations?
Yes, there is. Mm-hmm. It has not been finalized though, and I think there's a little bit of a capacity issue there within that committee, but yes, they're thinking about it. Oh yeah, look, look.
Thanks, Iris.
Sorry, I left the Just Transitions meeting 20 minutes early last night, so maybe it got flushed out after I left.
Great, welcome. So, what I'm thinking, my thoughts here is that we've got these core kind of task groups. The carbon budget one is somewhat of an outlier, and that's largely going to be accomplished by, at least initially, informing the RFP and the methodology associated with it. And then, the other tasks are kind of the substantive work of our subcommittee going forward. And my thinking would be that the kind of coordinator lead that we've identified would work with the other members to begin to just flesh out what that looks like, identify what the kind of outcomes, the priorities, the sequencing of that work looks like, and begin to map it out. My hope is that, sure, Jane, I'll do that in a second. My hope is that we'll get some guidance from the full council on the scope and nature of the climate action plan, as Jane mentioned earlier, and that will kind of inform how deep we need to go on certain of these tasks and, you know, how we prioritize them. But I think we can probably start that work now based on what we already assume our responsibilities will be. And let's just hold that thought. Jane suggested we let Iris and Abby talk a little bit more about the just transitions piece. So I don't know, Iris and Abby, if you're with us, you know, feel free to share very briefly, you know, what sort of coordination we're looking at regarding the equity analysis.
Hi, this is Iris Chung. Nice to meet you all. But I think Abby and I are planning on just sitting in on these meetings and then possibly giving feedback from Just Transitions and then bringing all of what you all are talking about back to Just kind of transition so we can begin to have a better idea of what we're going to be directing you all to do with regards to equity. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for being here and being willing to do that. Good. So does that is kind of what I just articulated, you know, and Abby, I don't know if you have any more you want to add to that, but does that sound like a reasonable approach and kind of free you all up as task groups to kind of move ahead with that work?
It makes sense to me.
And, you know, I think we're kind of early on. I think we probably can do this in a pretty unstructured way and let you all kind of work your way through it. You know, I know it's at some point we probably want to maybe come up with a little bit more structure around what those work plans look like. But for the time being, I think just really using the experience and expertise on your group, looking at our charge, looking at the act, and kind of nailing down what the focus of the relative groups will be is an important next step. Any thoughts, questions, comments on that?
Looks like Charlie has his hand up and then David.
Okay.
Oh, nope. Charlie says no. David?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the role of the A&R staff who are on these calls with regard to the task groups. That seems like an important element. And, you know, we're at the very beginning of our conversations, we talked about kind of giving some more helpful feedback and guidance to staff on what their roles could be. It seems like the participating in these work groups or task groups could be a particularly helpful role for them to both bring ideas to help us try to capture conversations in writing, giving us feedback from their professional expertise on ideas. So I want to just throw out whether this is a good moment to have that conversation.
Absolutely. And I had an earlier draft of this spreadsheet where I actually tried to make some suggested assignments of staff to the groups as well. I wanted that to be part of the discussion today. But yeah, I think this is where these folks who've been patiently kind of observing us can really dig in and add their experience and expertise and support the work of the groups. So, you know, I think we've got 4, maybe 5 State of Vermont folks servicing our committee: Marley Root, Bob Pop, and Allie from A&R, and Alex DePillis, and perhaps Judson from the Ag Agency. You know, I think if folks are on the call, if they want to kind of self-identify where they see themselves best fitting in support of this work, you know, we can have a brief conversation there, or we can take that offline and I can work with them and we can kind of get back to you all before next meeting on what that looks like. I don't know if anyone has a preference.
I think we're churning on this issue, Billy. It's a great question, and I'd like to circle back with my management. We have a weekly call, and we can.
Can you speak up a little bit,
Sorry
Alex?
about that. I guess I got the same thing as you got with your mic. Yeah, we're going to circle back to management this coming Wednesday, as we do every Wednesday, and we'll know more then. I'm eager to work on it. I've been working on it, and it's just the question is, now we're starting to talk about how do we plug in. So this is great work, and I'm eager to continue it. And I think we take it offline from my perspective, but I'm glad to listen if other people want to talk.
Great. So why don't we work within our respective agencies to nail that down? We'll let the task coordinators know kind of which staff and how they're going to support them before our next meeting, and get that going. Good. And Alex, just for your info, I fixed my microphone issue by, in the settings, you can turn the microphone to your computer and maintain the output in your ears so that you don't have to rely on your headphone microphone.
I'm just glad I don't have John Roberts' issue of getting old meetings sent to me. So, hey, whatever. This is a small thing. Thank you.
Lauren.
Yeah, while we talk about task coordinators and who's going to be supporting that work, I wanted to bring up something from the steering committee yesterday, and it's about Sophia, who I think is on the call, but her interest in staying a member of the subcommittee, but after stepping off of the full climate council. And as a steering committee, we discussed kind of just giving the authority to this subcommittee to discuss her role in this group. And for her values, and she's still coming to all these meetings, thank you, Sophia. I think we should probably hammer that out now while we're talking about people and places and make sure that we're all on the same page with how Sophia's showing up.
Great. I think that's a good suggestion. And I did include Sophia, in the task groups. I think in one of the groups that she requested, and then slotted her someplace slightly differently for the second group. And happy to talk more about that, Sophia, if that's a problem. But I'm certainly supportive of keeping her on. She's been contributing greatly so far. So Jane, I see you've got your hand up.
I just wanted to highlight that there will be a new council member placed in Sophia, nominated to serve where Sophia was on the council to represent the youth voice. And the way that the subcommittees were originally formed was ensuring that you had 5 council members on each committee. So I think it's great if you guys all support having Sophia stay on the group, but I just wanted to also flag that when and if a new counselor is appointed, it would make sense if they are interested for them to serve on this subcommittee so that you still have 5 counselors to vote if a vote ever had to happen. So I'm just going to flag that as perhaps you would get another subcommittee member later, but perhaps their expertise will fit better elsewhere and that might not play out. But just wanted to flag that sort of, it's not a tension, but just an issue that could come down the road.
Yeah, we're talking about you. Why don't you talk for yourself?
It's okay. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Lauren. And like regarding what Jane just said, I totally understand like if that person needs to fill my spot. I'm happy to be on this subcommittee, but if it comes to logistics, I'm like okay stepping off too. I'm very flexible. It's great working with you all and has been so far. So hopefully I can stay, but yeah. And Billy, no worries for the task coordination thing. It looks good to me. Thank you.
Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo you, Billy, and supporting Sophia staying on as the subcommittee member here. I think a lot of times the access to this type of professional conversation is really challenging, and it's really great that we have somebody from the youth coming here to talk to us and elevating that voice. So I would love to not make it more challenging or more of a barrier for her to come. So I would support Billy in keeping Sophia on as a member as well.
All right, well, seeing some nods. So yeah, I say let's, if everyone's agreeable, we'll kind of just stay the course. And if we get a new member and things get more complicated logistically with quorums and things of that nature, we can just reassess at that time. But certainly value Sophia's continued participation. Great. Okay, so at this point, can we just assume that the task coordinators will, on their own initiative, reach out to their groups and begin this next phase of our conversation, kind of fleshing out the individual tasks and how we're going to prioritize and do that work?
I think that makes sense unless anybody has any other specific comments that they want one or another task coordinator to hear as far as their thinking. But otherwise, I think it makes sense to sort of break out, have that begun after today.
Yeah, and I just want to, thanks, Abby. And I just want to reiterate, my intent and commitment that, the work of the different groups will be shared and accessible for everyone on the subcommittee, and that we can use our full meetings to kind of share and inform across the different task groups and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to share their perspective, because everyone has experience that's applicable to all these groups. We just had to make a division of labor. So that's my intent. All right, great. Well, go forth and prosper, as they say. All right, next thing we have here is discussion of what we're calling for now a ranking matrix. The idea here being that we're going to come up with a suite of recommended initiatives, policies, programs, strategies to address the various goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And there's probably going to be more than we'll ultimately settle on. So we'll need a way to rank them, prioritize them for their effect, their co-benefits, a whole range of criteria. And other states have developed similar kind of ranking rubrics. I suspect we'll probably get one broadly for the council's work, but I know that we should start talking about it specific to our subcommittee, and Lauren has offered to kind of pull together an initial draft and share that with you all as a vehicle to discuss just the general concept of whether and how we should create a tool like this, and then if there's agreement, what the specifics are.
Yeah, I can share my screen and kind of show you all. It's an incredibly draft form, and I hope that this subcommittee will feel very comfortable picking it apart and potentially rewriting it all together. But just to get a conversation started, just a second, let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Can you all see, Billy, I can only see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the right thing?
Yeah.
So I just created a quick spreadsheet for us to consider. That might be something that the task coordinators work with within their different conversations they're having for how we consider different strategies and actions that we'd like to recommend up to the full council. I've got a task area, which is really just a drop down. This is probably really tiny on your screen, but it captures the different task areas that we've discussed having as a committee. What the strategy we would be recommending is, a brief description of said strategy, whether or not there are co-benefits, and if there are, a quick list of those for consideration. Ideally, we'd be elevating strategies that have myriad co-benefits, since there's so much opportunity within our natural and working land sector. Addition of the guiding principles from the just transitions, whenever we do get those, it would be nice to include a drop down here that has like a multiple choice selection for any of the guiding principles that they come up with that might have relevance to the individual strategies we're recommending. Equity considerations, which I think we're also going to hope to hear from just transitions through Iris and Abby, but that we can consider too within our group here. Key partners, I don't know that needs to be on there, but within the state government, within NGOs, private sector, et cetera, for consideration as far as implementation is concerned. The impact and feasibility, just like a high, medium, and low matrix that we'd need to define what that would look like, but just for consideration as we prioritize which actions should be elevated up. I'm happy to stop sharing or leave this up if you all want to look at it. I'm sure I missed quite a few things or things that shouldn't be incorporated, so I'd love to hear some feedback from any or all of you.
There's a couple of hands up. I just have a quick initial question.
Yeah.
I know there is some analysis that's called for in the Act. Do these kind of categories track pretty well with the sorts of things that the Act asks us to look for in different strategies?
Yeah, so I think something like cost effectiveness would need to be in there, but I think the impact and feasibility, if you look at the actual words that I have beneath the chart, that high, medium, and low would need to be discussed. So like feasibility would be, cost effectiveness should be baked into there. And yeah, I would need to go back to the statute and make sure that the other things would be incorporated. But I would hope that if we would want to go with a high, medium, and low ranking, or 1 through 5 or something like that, that this group would come up with what those metrics would be.
Right.
Billy, my comment was related to that specifically. It is cost effectiveness, technological feasibility, and then equitability considerations. I do think feasibility has components of both cost effectiveness and technical feasibility, but a recommendation I would make is to keep them separate. I do think they are specific considerations that when I just think about the agricultural side, cost and scale of implementation and current adoption and likelihood of adoption makes those two parameters, I think, important to call out separately. Just be my thoughts there. Thanks.
Charlie?
Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree with what's been said about cost effectiveness and feasibility. I don't know if it would help or not, but in my head, I kind of try to segment strategies into buckets around, are they market-based solutions? Are they incentives? Are they regulatory mechanisms? So as we consider them, we can kind of think of, which bucket do those fall in? So I don't know if it would help to add a column there or not, because that also does a little bit get to the technical feasibility aspects of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and at some point we're going to have to speak to whether things require rulemaking or statute, or, so I think that will help with that. David?
Yeah, I had a question, Lauren, about, I'm particularly focused on the co-benefits piece, but it's also kind of a structural question, which is kind of how do we, will we put in just a narrative description of co-benefits, or will we also try to place a score or a numeric, some way of weighting it? And I think, it's probably true of all of these categories, but that one in particular feels like I would be surprised if we come up with strategies that don't all have co-benefits. Some will have more co-benefits than others, and some will have kind of, in some ways, competing co-benefits. Some may be more helpful in one area and less in another. And I think it's good to capture this, and I'm just wondering if we should go a step further and think about scoring it, or maybe you've already thought that through.
No, I think that is something that is in my mind, is weighting things that have more co-benefits than fewer, but I just didn't capture that, so I'll add it in now.
Looks like Alyssa, then Judy, then Allie.
Great. Lauren, this is great, really helpful way to offer feedback on the framework that you've developed. I think some of my comments have been addressed, but I would add that it might be important to have a space to talk about or just note anything we understand already about potential trade-offs. We have this nice section to talk about co-benefits, but there are some things that might have potential negative consequences that we would just want to note, as well as some, I'm not sure if it would go in where it would fit, but there are some things that we really understand well, and there are other strategies that have a greater degree of uncertainty. And so that might be, it'd be nice to know which place we'd put that comments about certainty and uncertainty. And then the third piece that you could add, maybe this is getting huge now that we're adding more columns, but something about time scale. Some of these strategies we talk about, we know that I'm really familiar with the carbon sequestration potential. There is kind of a maximum, right? And so we could see that being a really cost-effective strategy to use in a certain time period, but then we kind of max out the potential there. And so maybe that fits into the uncertainty and time scale piece, but yeah, looks good.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's really helpful.
Judy?
I have a question about the impacts column. What are you referring to? Criteria HM&L? Impact.
Yeah, I think that's something that we would ideally, we as a subcommittee would come up with, that we could identify what we consider to be high, medium, and low, and create several criteria therein.
Okay, thank you.
I hadn't started that yet, and I'd love for that to be a full subcommittee conversation. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you.
Any more thoughts or questions on this? Charlie.
Just one other thought on these is kind of around this idea that, what we do in Vermont, it's all like our state borders don't really matter in the long run. And so I don't know if there's anything around like national solutions versus, I don't know how to phrase this. I'm just thinking that like some of these things like the carbon markets occur on a national stage, or things like TCI occurs on a regional stage. So I don't know if there would be any kind of help in kind of nailing down like scale or geography. That's not a fully formed thought, but take it for what it is.
Just a quick reaction, if I could jump in, Charlie. I'm thinking that might fit as a kind of a piece of feasibility. What are the things that we can do as a state? What things require larger partnerships or engagement at a higher level?
Yeah, feasibility, but also there's an element of potential conflict, right? Like if we're pulling on this one, it might impact our ability to like, do it because it's all kind of nested. But I agree, yeah.
Just further piggybacking on Charlie's comment, for example, the Dairy Innovation Center, which is an organization backed by the Dairy Checkoff, which is something that all dairy farmers pay for various things. But the Dairy Innovation Center has a goal of net zero carbon by 2050, and they are working towards that on a national scale for the dairy industry.
John, do you have a recommendation for how I might add that to my growing list of notes down here? If at all, or just something that we should consider as we further develop this?
Well, I think it comes into incorporating national national plans, because obviously our carbon does not stay in Vermont. It drifts somewhere, and just like acid rain used to drift onto us.
This is really random, but oh my gosh, I have to make a comment on that, John, because that's the thing that bothers me. People think that because we're in a certain area of the world, we're not going to be affected by our own their other states' actions or our own actions. I'm kind of just on a rant, but say you have a bomb, if they're going to be oh, I'm going to bomb your country, that's just going to come back. It's karma. But yeah, I don't know where that came from. I just had to speak because I haven't been talking this whole meeting. But yes. And also, Lauren, that looks good. Thank you for pulling that together. And Alyssa, I also liked your comments and agree.
Sophia, if it helps, I don't think that, it might be slightly random in the context of this framework, but I think that as far as the way that we are trying to approach the work, and certainly factoring in what I imagine could potentially be guiding principles from Just Transitions, or factoring in an equity framework, if we're doing quote unquote everything right in Vermont, but the impact on another place because of the decisions that we're making and the choices that we're making to electrify or however that plays out is having a horrific impact somewhere else in the world, then we aren't actually having a positive impact. It's sort of, I personally have an issue with the framing of net zero, because I think it gives people the idea that they can somehow remove their impact from the world, which is not something that can happen. We can balance our impact, but we can't remove it. So I think that all of that
like that's oh sorry I
no, that's okay. I think that those bigger frameworks will will be built in, I hope, into how we're thinking about the strategies, the co-benefits, the trade-offs, the way that we frame all of that up as we move forward.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's like one thing I like think a lot about, is because when looking at renewables or the work of this climate council, we also have to like look at where things are being sourced, and who is sourcing them and how those people are being treated, which is like a lot of equity. But even though if we're buying like good things in Vermont, but then we're also sourcing things from like China, which I don't know if we are doing that or plan on doing that, but you get the point. So yeah, that's kind of where I was getting at, but I don't know why I used the bomb like example. That was bad.
Jake, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, hopefully my internet holds up here. Yeah, I think what we're talking about, it may not be its own column, but it feels very much related to Alyssa's comment about trade-offs, and then Charlie's comment about sort of scale, like there's scale interactions. We can have strategies where trade-offs are that there's impacts, elsewhere in the country or in the world that should be considered, and then a strategy at a state level might have scale interactions with national policy and vice versa. So just keeping that in mind, and then to what I think David said, is that there's an element of that then feeds into how we consider the feasibility of that strategy. If it's going to be other elements coming in kind of into alignment at various scales, then the feasibility of that becomes more difficult, but potentially also higher impact. So I think it's kind of it feels like a criteria that we just need to really elevate and be explicit about.
So this is great. I think we're taking a tool that will be helpful and refining it. Lauren, is this something you'd be willing to maybe do a little bit more work on and kind of share with folks in advance of our next meeting, and we'll try to nail it down next Friday?
Yeah, I'd love to, but I'd also welcome any assistance between now and then, whether through like a call or just send me emails with your thoughts, especially with those criteria specific high, medium, lows, the consideration for how we weight co-benefits, trade-off considerations, especially anything like that. If you have any ideas, I'd love to see them. But thanks for feedback now. This has been certainly good fodder for editing this.
Do we need to Judy's point earlier, do we need to nail down, or at what point do we need to nail down what impact is for this framework? Or is that something, different people coming from different lenses view impact very differently? So I'm just sort of wondering, is that a conversation we need to have next week as to how we will be analyzing impact?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
certainly I think we're going to need to figure out what the kind of positive impacts towards achieving the goals of the act are of the different strategies. But certainly we should figure out how we acknowledge whatever negative impacts or maladaptive results are associated with certain strategies. Okay, great. Well, why don't we wrap this conversation down? We'll go over kind of next week's agenda and assignments at the end of this meeting, but one of them will be getting Lauren comments, any additional comments on this piece before next week, before next Friday. All right, let's see. Next up is inventory of existing programs. I honestly haven't had time to do anything on this since we last spoke. I don't know, Abby, if you have. I don't think so. I know that we've had some state of Vermont staff who have offered to assist us with this. I'm going to pull together some people early next week to kind of get this ball moving so that we've got something substantive to report back on next week. But I don't know if there's anything folks want to add on this topic right now. It's important.
Billy, as you received feedback, did you like create a spreadsheet or like some type of inventory of said inventory so we could kind of look at it and consider?
I have yet to. No. Okay. I have everything kind of in one place, so I know I have everyone's feedback, but we haven't done anything with it yet. And that's the conversation with some state of Vermont folks I want to have on Monday, so we can either I or the collective we can get that back to folks before next Friday. Okay, so we're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. Really, the last substantive things we have are to set assignments and agenda for our next meeting and to take public comment. Given that we have a few extra minutes, is there anything else members would like to talk about before we move on to those items? All right. David, I saw it in your eyes. You're muted.
Thanks, Billy. I can't resist a couple of spare moments. But going back to the co-benefits, I know a lot of us have been thinking about this, and it seems a particularly acute issue for this group to address and to give some fairly deep thought to, because there's so much room for conflict and debate and miscommunication. And there's going to be some qualitative and subjective and professional, interpretation that has to come into this discussion. But I do think there are some methodologies. I've just started looking at some of them, but it's starting to look at what are direct co-benefits. That result. Say we were talking about wetlands, for instance. There may be a direct co-benefit in the sense, direct in the sense of it also has a direct relationship to carbon or greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then there may be things that are secondary or even tertiary that are also important. And so I just throw like, wildlife habitat would be an obvious one for Audubon to advocate for. But then there's others that are less obvious, like the degree to which we have things that support a rural working economy in Vermont may not at first glance seem like it has anything to do with climate. Yet, if one of our greatest threats is the conversion of land, farmland or forest land to development, which I think it is, and if that kind of development also increases the degree to which people spend time in their cars and traveling and commuting, which I think it does, then thinking about how to provide financial and economic incentives for rural landowners to continue to be able to keep their land in those states, whether it's farming or forestry, may be a really vital benefit specific to Vermont that we should think about, given the predominance of privately owned land. And it's a harder one to calculate as a co-benefit when we're thinking in the context of climate. But there is a kind of a secondary or at least tertiary kind of pathway that for me is pretty clear. I throw that out just that I'm hopeful that this group, that we don't get locked into too quickly into posturing around that, because I think it's sufficiently complicated and complex that, and we represent a mix of different perspectives, that we can probably have a fairly rich discussion about that may not bring us to agreement, but will get us, in terms of what we think that perfect outcome may be, but it will get us to agreement in terms of what are reasonable ways to frame those choices.
Thanks, David. I completely agree. I think, probably of all the subcommittees, ours has the greatest opportunity to really maximize those co-benefits for Vermonters. And, it's not as linear as maybe some of the other groups work. So we'll have to, figure out how we get there, but there's great opportunity. So thanks for flagging that. Alyssa.
Yeah, my comment relates perfectly to what David was talking about. And I think the types of co-benefits that we consider in our work, I think, should be as multifaceted as possible. I think it's really easy, especially as somebody who works in research, it's really easy to focus on the things that we can count and that we can easily quantify, because it's easier to measure, right, and say something definitive about. But we know that there are tons of co-benefits that fall into things like cultural ecosystem services that have been hugely important to Vermonters through the pandemic in terms of just the way that natural landscapes have helped with mental health. And I just hope that those aspects that are more complex and hard to measure and describe don't get lost in the final report that we contribute to.
As we talk about subcommittee assignments, I'll just say it sounds like both David and Alyssa, unbeknownst to them, signed up for maybe a call with me next week to talk co-benefits and how we consider them. So I'll just be poking both of you probably.
All right, so let's, Judy, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand, please.
I'd like to also consider, when you're discussing co-benefits, that you consider the impact of the perceived benefit on marginalized people. Because that's pretty severe problem sometimes.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think there's the, what's the positive benefit, what's the negative benefit, and then what's the pros or cons for certain communities that maybe aren't the ones we're thinking of when we do that initial consideration. Okay.
I would imagine too that is part of what that equity assessment and framework will help us establish as well. Is, we have this, how have marginalized and disinvested communities been impacted by this historically, and then also like what is the potential outcome to this moving into the future, and how do we ensure that that's mitigated if this is a strategy that we choose to pursue.
Okay, folks ready to move on to our next item? Okay, so this is our agenda and assignments for our April 9th meeting. And I've been just kind of keeping a list as we've been going. I'll throw it out there and let me know what you think. We'll probably be ready to talk about the existing programs inventory, so we'll have a discussion point there. It sounds like we'll want to come back and kind of finalize, get an update on the finalized technical assistance RFP. We'll probably want to spend some time talking about the next draft of the ranking matrix with a particular focus on how we track co-benefits, negative impacts, and how those perceived benefits affect marginalized people. And then to the extent task coordinators have had an opportunity to talk with their groups or give some thought to their respective charges, maybe just a quick update on where that work stands. How does that sound for an agenda? Or are there things we should add, subtract, change? All right, Alyssa with the 2 thumbs up. Take it. Okay. And then kind of assignments to support that, folks should get their comments to Lauren on the ranking matrix. And I don't know, Lauren, if you want to set any sort of deadline for that.
No, it can be ongoing. It's fine.
And then, my hope is that we'll be able to get kind of a compilation of the inventory of existing programs pulled together, probably by the kind of middle of the end of next week, and get it out to you all to review before our next meeting. How does that sound as a plan for next week? Good? All right, well, we'll write that up and we'll get that all out to you. All right, so we are running a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think we're probably ready to go into public comment unless there's anything else we want to discuss as a group. Okay. So let's see. So anyone, members of the public who are here, if you're interested in speaking, if you've got the ability to raise your digital hand, please do so, and I'll read off those names. And if you don't hear your name and you want to talk, let me know. So far we've got Mark Whitworth, Cheryl Joy Lipton, and Jennifer Ramstetter. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Okay. So in my screen, the order is Mark, Cheryl, and Jennifer. And if you could each take, about 2 or 3 minutes with your comments, you can take it from there. So Mark, stage is yours.
Thanks, Billy. Very interesting discussion today, and I thank you all for your thoughtful contributions to it. And so at the beginning of the meeting, you started talking about gross emissions versus net emissions. And as the law stands right now, the only thing that matters is gross emissions. And even if you convince legislators that our interim goals should include net emissions, you won't really be accounting for the other climate contributions that our agricultural and forest lands make. And I was actually absolutely chilled by the thought that by 2050, our goal is to be net zero. And in the meantime, landowners may engage in contracts that invalidate the inclusion of the sequestration of their land from the equation. So we could do a tremendous amount of work achieving what in reality is net zero, but when we do the accounting, is not net zero, that we are still, in spite of our best efforts, greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that, I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't think that you can prevent forest landowners from entering into agreements with other states or other countries to offset emissions, but this seems to me to be a tremendous threat to what you are trying to accomplish. So I was absolutely chilled by that thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Cheryl.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Thank you.
Part of what Mark said just now, I think, is speaking about the similar thing that I'm talking about, and that many people here already talked about, is that I have a few things. I'll just try to go through them pretty quickly. We need to include storage comment, not only sequestration, when we talk about, and some people are doing that, but I'm not seeing that term storage as much as I think it should be every time we have sequestration. on. It elevates older forests and older trees in importance. And then I also really believe that I see land use planning, it belongs in here in this subcommittee as more of a primary topic, not as a comment in all the other in so many different discussions. It, you know, Alexandra also commented on land use changes, increasing emissions, and I think David talked about it as well. And Alexandra talked about needing more impact, taking into consideration urban, suburban trees and you know, and shrubs and the vegetation in our towns and villages, and also reforesting riparian areas. So let's see, what else? Additionally, you know, just transitions and co-benefits, and talking about how Judy brought, and all of you are talking about co-benefits, talking about the land, really co-benefits and just transition, including our native fauna, insects, animals, ecosystems as a whole, and how important our land use planning is in this, and stopping the parcelization and rural sprawl that we're seeing, that is really brings land use planning up to a major component of this ecosystems and agriculture subcommittee. So I don't know if I wrote so much down, and I don't know if I said it all, but I know I've touched on a lot of the topics. Let me make sure. And one more thing is, I have a question on how we are able to see the documents. That can the public be seeing documents that you guys are looking at, including these FYIs from Jane, et cetera?
Yes, thank you for your comment. And I do believe that all of the kind of working documents that we use as a group are supposed to go up on the website under our subcommittee. I think I have been remiss in doing that, but it's one of my to-dos this afternoon to figure out how to get all that stuff up. So I will certainly make sure that the spreadsheets and the Word documents and the things that we've been developing as a group, as products, will be up and available to the public. As far as emails that go from Jane to the members, I don't know, you know, those are public records. I think that you'd need to kind of put in a records request to get all those emails. You could certainly reach out to Jane directly to see if those are things she could just share with you in a running and informal way. So I don't know the answer to that, but certainly the work products that we develop should be up on the website, and I'm going to work to get that taken care of, you know, either today or early next week.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks especially to Jane for having the public comment section up. And I noted that for example, the draft RFP is up as well. And so that was very helpful to be able to see some of the details of that. One of the things that I plan to put in the public comment portal are a couple of articles, scientific articles, that talk about the importance of soil carbon sequestration in agricultural soils, and in how that varies depending on what type of agriculture is carried out, and with different forestry practices and different forest ecosystems as well. So I'm hoping to add those, and hoping that they might spark a few ideas for the RFP of how to incorporate that a little bit more for the public. Also, thinking about things like TEK, and thinking about the co-benefits, which I think the Lawrence chart was really helpful in beginning to think about that. So I'm hopeful that some of those resources will be useful as you develop the final RFP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other members of the public that would like to comment at this time? Super. Well, thank you all. Those are very thoughtful and helpful for us to consider. And encourage you all to continue to submit written comments through the new portal so that we have a good written record as well. Anything else that the subcommittee wants to discuss today? Great. Well, before we adjourn, I just say, hey, Lauren, could you send me the latest draft of the screening tool that we looked at today so that I can include that in what gets posted on the website?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Okay. And Abby, anything you want to add right now?
Don't think so. Thank you so much to everybody for coming and contributing.
Yeah, thanks again, and we'll get draft agenda admins out to you as quickly as we can, and we'll see you all next week. All right, thanks. I'm going to stop recording now.
Everyone.
Bye.
Good weekend.
Yeah, have a nice weekend.